The alarm didn't even get the chance to buzz. Ellie Whitmore's eyes opened on their own just a few minutes before 6. The room was still dark, but the grey-blue light of dawn had already begun to slip between the faded curtains. She didn't move at first, just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the low hum of wind brushing against the windows, the same wind that had rocked that little house every night of her life. She knew that today wasn't just another morning. It was the morning. The room felt smaller than usual, as if it too knew she was leaving. Ellie slowly sat up, her flannel pajama shirt sticking slightly to her back from the nervous sweat she hadn't even noticed. Around her, the familiar walls were lined with framed memories, grainy Polaroids of a childhood lived simply, a smiling 7-year-old with dirt-streaked cheeks holding up a fish by the lake, a crinkled photograph of her standing between her parents in front of the Christmas tree, wearing a handmade sweater 3 sizes too big. Everything in that room was a piece of her, from the scuffed wooden desk covered in old notebooks and dried flower petals, to the snow globe collection on the shelf above her bed. Each object whispered, "Don't forget us." She stood barefoot on the cold wooden floor and crossed to the small dresser by the window. There, neatly laid out, was her travel outfit: dark jeans, a forest green turtleneck sweater, and a long beige coat her mom had insisted she take. "Chicago gets bitter in the winter," she'd said, even though it was barely October. On top of her clothes sat a small leather-bound journal with the initials EW engraved in faded gold. Her mother had given it to her on her 17th birthday and told her, "One day, when your life is too full to carry in your head, you'll need this." Today felt like that day. She started to pack. Slowly, deliberately, folding each item with care, as if the way she placed her socks could somehow influence how her life would unfold on the other side of the country. Her fingers trembled slightly as she zipped the suitcase. Not because she was afraid of the city, but because once she walked out of that room, nothing would ever be the same. The sound of soft footsteps echoed in the hallway. Then a gentle knock. "Ellie." It was her mother's voice, a voice that carried both warmth and worry. The door creaked open, revealing Darlene Whitmore, wrapped in her faded blue robe, her graying hair tied back in a messy bun, and eyes already red around the edges. "You're up early." Ellie nodded. "Couldn't sleep." Darlene smiled, but her lips didn't quite commit. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. For a moment, she didn't speak, just stood there, taking in her daughter's almost empty room like it was a museum. Then she walked over and placed a hand on Ellie's shoulder. It was cool, soft, and shaking. "Today's a big day," she said gently, her voice cracking as she looked into her daughter's eyes. "You're really doing it. Going beyond these hills like you always dreamed." "I don't feel as ready as I thought I'd be," Ellie admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "No one ever does," Darlene said, brushing a strand of hair from Ellie's face. "But that doesn't mean you shouldn't go." They stood there in silence for a few moments, the weight of the moment pressing down on both of them. Then came the smell. A faint, familiar aroma of something burning wafted in from downstairs. Ellie looked toward the door and let out a quiet laugh. "Dad's cooking again." "God help us," Darlene muttered, and for a brief moment, they both smiled. The kind of smile that hurts because it only happens when you're trying not to cry. Downstairs, the old house groaned as they walked down the narrow staircase. In the kitchen, the overhead light buzzed weakly. At the stove stood Everett Whitmore, wearing his usual worn-in flannel shirt, jeans that had seen one too many winters, and an apron that said Grill King despite his well-known inability to cook anything but toast. He turned when he heard them, lifting a spatula in greeting. "Hey there, sunshine," he said to Ellie, though his voice was flatter than usual. "Figured I'd make your last Idaho breakfast special." Ellie peeked over his shoulder at the slightly charred pancakes stacked on a chipped plate. "They look toasty." Everett let out a low chuckle. "Just the way you like, Em." blackened with love. They sat down at the kitchen table, which had belonged to Darlene's parents before them. The finish was worn, but the wood was strong, like everything in that house. No one touched the food at first. They just sat there, surrounded by quiet and the ticking of the wall clock. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was heavier than that. Sacred. Everett finally broke it. "I know you're excited," he said, carefully folding his hands together. "Chicago's gonna give you the kind of life we never could. Opportunity. Choices. You deserve that." Ellie lowered her eyes, her hands wrapped around the warm mug of coffee her mom had placed in front of her. "But listen to me," Everett continued, his voice turning more serious. "That city's big, loud, fast. There's good people there, sure, but there's also people who'll take everything if you let 'em. You've got a good head on your shoulders, and I need you to keep it on straight." "I will, Dad," Ellie said softly. "And if it ever gets too hard, if you feel lost, this place, this house, this table, it's always yours. Doesn't matter how long you've been gone. You call, and we'll bring you home." That was it. That's what shattered the wall she tried to build since the night she got accepted to university. Ellie pushed back her chair and walked around the table to her father, throwing her arms around him with a strength that surprised even her. Everett, who never cried, not even at funerals, buried his face in her hair and pulled her in tighter. "I'm proud of you," he whispered. "I'm scared," she admitted, choking on her own breath. "Good. Means you care. But you're ready, baby. You're stronger than you think." Darlene stepped closer and held out a small item wrapped in a piece of tissue. Ellie pulled back just enough to take it. She unwrapped it slowly and found the eagle keychain, tarnished silver, the wings slightly bent, but still beautiful. "You remember this?" Darlene asked. Ellie nodded, smiling through tears. "You had this on your keys for years. It always reminded me that no matter how far you fly, you can always come home. Keep it with you, okay? Whenever you feel alone. Hold it." Ellie placed it in her coat pocket like a treasure. A few minutes later, the sound of tires crunching gravel echoed from the end of the driveway. The bus was here. She hugged her mom one last time, pressing her face into Darlene's shoulder. "Thank you. For everything." "I love you, Elle," Darlene whispered. So much." Outside, the air was crisp, the ground still damp from the night before. Ellie walked slowly toward the bus, her parents following behind her. She turned around just before climbing the steps and looked at them, her anchors, her history, standing there in front of the porch with the sun just starting to rise behind them. She waved, and they waved back. And then the door closed. From her window seat, she could still see them standing there, holding on to each other. And just like that, the world she knew disappeared behind a curtain of mist and mountains. She didn't know it yet, but that would be the last time she saw them like that, whole together, untouched by what was coming. The bus rumbled forward, and Ellie Whitmore rode into a future that would test everything she believed about herself, love, and the meaning of home. If you like interesting stories, leave your like, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications to stay updated with all our content. And let us know in the comments where you're watching this video from. We'd love to hear from you. The bus hummed with a low, steady vibration, like a distant storm trapped beneath its wheels. Ellie sat near the back, wrapped in her coat, her forehead pressed gently to the cold glass. Her breath fogged the window in soft bursts, fading quickly against the ever-changing scenery. It had been nearly 30 hours since she left Red Creek. The open, endless fields of Idaho were far behind her now. In their place, mile after mile of unfamiliar land, gas stations with names she didn't recognize, diners filled with strangers, and flat, lonely highways that stretched out like ribbons into the unknown. But now the horizon was changing. It started slowly, a flash of metal, a flicker of red brake lights, then the sudden appearance of billboards that towered above tired factories and skeletal trees. Concrete replaced soil. Buildings climbed higher. The sky seemed to sink lower. Chicago. Even the air felt different. Dense, gritty, and electric. The kind of air that vibrates with ambition and loneliness at the same time. As the bus turned off the interstate and snaked through city streets, Ellie sat upright, suddenly alert. Outside, crowds of people crossed wide intersections in coats too thin for the weather. Horns blared without rhythm. The skyline loomed above everything, indifferent and magnificent. Her pulse quickened. She wanted to feel brave. She wanted to believe she belonged in a place like this. But deep down, she felt small, like a misplaced word in a language she didn't speak yet. At Canal Street Station, the bus hissed to a stop. The driver's voice crackled through the speaker. "End of the line, folks." Ellie stood up slowly, her limbs stiff from the long ride. She hoisted her suitcase, heavier now somehow, and stepped off the bus into a gust of wind that cut straight through her sweater. The noise hit her first. The voices, the foot traffic, the swirl of taxis and buses and vendors calling out in every direction. She had never seen so many people moving so fast with such clear purpose. She stood still for a moment, swallowed by the rush of it all. Then, holding her breath, she waved down a cab. The driver, a man in his 60s with silver hair and headphones hanging around his neck, didn't ask where she was from. He just nodded when she handed him a printed paper with her dorm address and pulled into traffic without a word. Ellie stared out the window as they passed row after row of apartment buildings, shops with names in languages she didn't recognize, and flashing signs advertising 24-hour laundromats, pawn shops, and psychic readings. The city was beautiful, yes, but not in the way she expected. It wasn't grand. It was real. Worn. Tired in some places. Restless in others. Hyde Park appeared like a sudden exhale. The neighborhood felt quieter. Older, too. Brownstones stood in rows like time-worn guardians. Ivy crawled up their sides. The trees had already begun to shed their leaves, scattering reds and yellows onto sidewalks cracked by decades of winters. The cab stopped in front of a tall, narrow building made of dark brick and shaded windows. A crooked iron gate marked the entrance. Ellie paid the fare, stepped out, and looked up. There were 4 floors and no elevator. A small brass plate near the front read, St. Augustine Women's Residence, Esther 1953. Before she could knock, the door buzzed and creaked open. An older man with tired blue eyes, a heavy tan cardigan, and a clipboard greeted her. "You must be Ellie Whitmore." "Yes, sir," she answered, trying to steady her voice. He offered a small smile. "Name's Halford. I run this place. Keep the peace and the pipes working. Don't expect luxury, but you'll have a roof, heat, and stairs that only creak most of the time." Ellie laughed nervously. They climbed together, step after creaking step, to the 3rd floor. Halford handed her a heavy key marked 3C. "Your room. Shared bathrooms at the end of the hall. Quiet hours start at 10. Don't feed the pigeons on the fire escape. They'll never leave." "Got it," Ellie said, gripping the key. "If you need anything," he added, "you'll find me downstairs most nights listening to old jazz on the radio. Welcome to Chicago, kid. It's a good place to start something." She nodded, grateful for the kindness in his tone. Inside her room, the air was stale, but it wasn't unpleasant. There was a twin bed against the wall, a narrow desk, a radiator that made soft hissing sounds, and a window that faced an alley between buildings. From the corner, she could see the tip of Lake Michigan in the distance, shimmering between rooftops. She placed her suitcase on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed. It didn't feel like hers yet. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the silver eagle keychain. The metal was cool in her palm. She ran her thumb along its wings. "You can always come home," she heard her mother's voice whisper again. That night, she didn't unpack. She didn't cry. She didn't sleep. She just sat by the window, watching the occasional flicker of headlights pass through the alley below, feeling the enormity of the city pressing in on all sides. But in her chest, beneath the fear, under the weight of change, there was a flicker of something else. Possibility. And a question she couldn't yet answer. What would this place make of her? It had been 3 weeks since Ellie started classes at the University of Chicago, and she still felt like a ghost walking through someone else's life. The campus was sprawling, a maze of towering libraries and ivy-covered buildings, filled with people who seemed to always know where they were going, what they were doing, and who they belonged with. Ellie, on the other hand, clutched her campus map like a lifeline and often ate lunch alone on a bench near the administration building, watching others move in packs, laughing, belonging. Each day, she went from lecture halls to the dorm and back again. Her roommates changed faces every time someone dropped out or transferred. She hadn't made a single real friend. Her calls home became shorter, more forced. Darlene would talk about the weather in Idaho, about the neighbor's new dog, and try not to ask too many questions Ellie wasn't ready to answer. Everett always just said, "Keep your chin up, kid," and passed the phone back. And Ellie tried. She went to orientation mixers, sat in the back of study groups, and even joined a campus club for students from rural towns. But she felt invisible, a small-town girl in a city that moved faster than her thoughts. That's when it happened. It was a Thursday afternoon. The sky was overcast, the wind sharp with that coming of winter bite. Ellie ducked into the campus cafe between classes, juggling a stack of textbooks in one hand and her tote bag in the other. Her fingers were frozen. She hadn't slept the night before, trying to finish an essay that her professor would later call technically solid, but lacking voice. She didn't even know what that meant anymore. She waited in line, ordered a black coffee, no time for cream, and turned, rushing toward a corner table. That's when she collided with him. The collision sent her coffee tumbling through the air in slow motion, splashing across a pile of papers and a black moleskine notebook. "Oh my God," she gasped. "I'm so sorry." The guy stood up from his seat, blinking in surprise. He had dark eyes, sharp cheekbones, and a quiet calm about him that made the room seem suddenly quieter. The coffee had soaked through half his notes, but he didn't look angry. "Relax," he said, his voice smooth. "I should have seen you coming. I've been hogging this table for hours." Ellie started grabbing napkins from the dispenser, panicking. "I didn't mean to. Your papers. Are they ruined?" He laughed, a low, easy laugh, and began dabbing at the mess. "Most of them were sketches. My professors will survive." "Sketches. Architecture," he said, holding up the stained notebook. The inside was filled with intricate drawings, buildings, cityscapes, rooftop gardens. "I'm a senior. Or I will be, if I stop skipping lectures." Ellie felt her cheeks burn. "I'll buy you another coffee. Please. It's the least I can do." The guy smiled and extended a hand. "Silas." "Ellie," she said, shaking it, surprised by the warmth of his grip. And just like that, something shifted. They sat together for over an hour. She bought him a coffee, then one for herself. Silas told her about his hometown, a forgotten place in southern Alabama, all fields and rust, as he called it. He'd come to Chicago with nothing but a duffel bag and his sketchbooks. He talked about the city with the affection of someone who had been broken by it but chose to stay anyway. Ellie found herself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in weeks. He asked her about Idaho. She expected him to tune out when she talked about hay bales and 4th of July parades, but he didn't. He leaned in. He listened. When they left the cafe, he walked her back to the dorm. "I don't usually do this," he said at the door, shifting his weight. "But if you ever need a tour guide or someone to talk about how much dorm food sucks, I'm around." Ellie smiled. "I'd like that." He didn't text her that night, or the next. She thought about it more than she wanted to. Then, on Sunday morning, she found a paper bag taped to her dorm door. Inside, a blueberry muffin, a napkin with a hand-drawn sketch of the cafe where they'd met, and a note. "Figured I owed you one. S." Her chest filled with something soft, something unfamiliar, a flicker of light in the grey fog of her new life. From that day on, Silas became a presence. They started meeting between classes, sometimes by accident, sometimes not. He showed her hidden spots in the city, a rooftop that overlooked the lake, a narrow bookstore where the owner let them sit on the floor for hours, a Thai place with $6 pad CEW that she couldn't pronounce but loved anyway. He had that kind of charm that didn't try too hard. He listened more than he talked, but when he spoke, his words stuck. He didn't flood her phone with texts or overwhelm her with attention. He just showed up when she needed someone, like he could sense it. With him, Ellie laughed more, breathed deeper. She started sleeping again, answering her mom's calls with a little more life in her voice. She didn't talk about Silas, though. Not yet. At first, it felt harmless, a distraction, a way to feel seen in a city that had swallowed her whole. But slowly, Silas became more than that. He started walking her home every night, started waiting for her after classes. When she talked, he looked at her like her words mattered, like she mattered. And Ellie, the girl who once ate lunch alone on a stone bench, now had someone who walked beside her, who made Chicago feel just a little less impossible. She didn't know it yet, but meeting Silas would be the beginning of everything, and eventually, the unraveling of all she thought she knew. It was mid-November when Silas first brought her to his place. They had just left the Art Institute, a spontaneous detour after class that turned into hours spent meandering through halls lined with oil portraits and abstract sculptures. Ellie had never seen him so animated. His eyes lit up when he talked about the way certain buildings in the city borrowed from ancient geometry, how light and shadow played like music across surfaces. She didn't understand half of it, but she loved watching him come alive. Outside, the sky was bruised with early dusk, and the wind had turned icy, pushing people down the sidewalks in tight coats and hurried steps. Ellie tucked her scarf closer, her cheeks numb with cold. "You hungry?" Silas asked as they walked. "I know a place." She nodded, but instead of heading toward the busier part of town, he steered them toward quieter streets, westward, through a neighborhood of old brick buildings, narrow alleys, and faded murals. Logan Square, a part of Chicago she hadn't explored before. They stopped in front of a tall walk-up with ivy creeping up one side. The windows were dark, except for a soft amber glow on the 3rd floor. "This is it," he said casually, unlocking the gate. "My place." Ellie hesitated. "You live here?" "Yeah. Been here since summer. It's nothing fancy, but it's mine." He smiled at her, half playfully, half daring her to say no. "You coming?" She followed him up the stairs. The apartment was warm, small, but full of life. a lived-in kind of space that felt like a strange cross between a studio and a greenhouse. There were plants everywhere, vines hanging from curtain rods, succulents along the windowsills, a giant ficus in the corner reaching for the ceiling. Books lay open on the coffee table. Notebooks, sketch pads, coffee mugs half full, a mattress on the floor, a cracked record player, and a faint smell of cinnamon and ink. Ellie stood in the doorway, unsure of what to say. "It's cozy," she offered. Silas grinned. "You can say it. It's a mess. But it's home." He made ramen, real ramen, not the instant kind, with soft-boiled eggs and sliced scallions and hot broth that thawed her fingers. They ate on the floor, legs crossed under a blanket, while Miles Davis played low in the background. At one point, he leaned back, watching her, his eyes darker than usual. "You know, I like it better when you're here," he said. Ellie looked down at her bowl, unsure how to respond. Her heart thudded, not with fear, not yet, but with that strange, fluttering tension that comes when something shifts. He kept talking. "This place used to feel too quiet, too temporary. But you make it feel like I'm not always waiting for something to fall apart." She looked at him, surprised. "You don't seem like someone who waits for things." Silas shrugged. "I pretend well." There was silence, the kind that settles when something unspoken is circling the room, waiting for an opening. Then he said it. "Move in with me." Ellie blinked. "What?" Silas leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. "I'm serious. You hate your dorm, the noisy girls, the broken heater, the creepy showers. Here, you'd have space, a real bed. We could split groceries. Rent's cheap. I'm not asking you to marry me. I'm just asking you to stay." She stared at him, unsure if she should laugh or cry. "Silas, I don't know. I mean, it's fast." "It's not," he said quickly. "We've known each other for months. You're always here anyway." We click, Ellie. "I feel it. Don't you?" She did. That was the problem. Part of her wanted to say yes right there, to surrender to the warmth, the comfort, the illusion of something solid in a city that felt like shifting sand. But another part, quieter but stubborn, whispered warnings about moving too fast, about not telling her parents, about how little she actually knew of his past. "I'd have to think about it," she said, choosing her words carefully. He nodded. "Of course. No pressure." But the next morning, she woke up tangled in his arms, the smell of coffee and cinnamon in the air, and the weight of the city somehow lighter. By the end of the week, she said yes. She didn't tell her parents. She didn't tell anyone. She packed slowly, secretly, transferring her life from the dorm to Silas's apartment one bag at a time. Clothes, books, a small jewelry box, the silver eagle keychain from her mother, which she placed carefully on the windowsill beside the tallest plant. It felt reckless. It felt thrilling. It felt like she was writing her own story, finally, and for a while, it was everything she hoped. Silas was attentive, gentle, funny. He made her laugh when classes overwhelmed her. He ran to the bodega for snacks during her late-night study sessions. He held her when the cold wind rattled the windows and her chest tightened with homesickness. She'd never felt so seen, so chosen. He made the city feel smaller, made her believe that maybe she wasn't as lost as she thought. And yet, sometimes, late at night, as the city buzzed outside their window, Ellie would wake up and stare at the ceiling, heart racing for reasons she couldn't explain. Something in her had started to shift. She just didn't know yet what it was, or what it would cost her. The first signs were subtle. At first, Ellie chalked it up to stress. Midterms were closing in, deadlines stacking one on top of another. Silas was always sketching late into the night, papers and pencils scattered across the apartment like breadcrumbs of a tired mind. He barely slept, barely smiled. The warmth in his voice cooled, not all at once, but like a slow leak in a tire you don't notice until the ride turns bumpy. It started with the small things. "You're wearing that?" he asked one morning as Ellie buttoned up a cream-colored blouse. There was no teasing in his tone, just flat judgment. "What's wrong with it?" she asked, her voice light, trying to brush it off. He shrugged. "Nothing. Just, it's a little tight, isn't it?" She turned away, pretending not to hear, but the words sank like lead. Another time, she mentioned maybe grabbing coffee with some classmates after a study group. Silas looked up from his sketch pad, his eyes hardening. "Why? You barely know them." "I was just thinking." "You don't need them," he said, his voice cutting. "They don't get you like I do." It was phrased like protection, but it settled on her skin like possession. After that, she started hesitating. Before leaving the apartment, before texting someone back, before calling her mom. And then, even that became difficult. "Can't you talk to them later?" he asked one Sunday when her phone rang during breakfast. It was Darlene. Ellie hadn't picked up the last 2 times, and she knew her mom would be worried. "It's just my mom." Silas sighed, loud and performative, then got up and started stacking dishes with unnecessary force. "We were talking." Ellie swallowed hard. She let the call go to voicemail. The next time Darlene called, Ellie answered in the stairwell, whispering so he wouldn't hear. She didn't tell her mother about any of it. Not about the comment on her clothes. Not about the silences. Not about the way Silas had started checking her phone, glancing too long at the screen whenever a notification popped up. She told herself it was a phase, a hard week, a miscommunication. But then the door slammed. It was late, almost midnight. Ellie had stayed on campus to work on a group presentation, something she hadn't told Silas about because the last time she did, he sulked for hours and accused her of pulling away. She walked into the apartment and felt it immediately, the thick silence, the kind that had shape and weight. Silas sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her like she was a stranger. His jaw was tight, a muscle ticking at the side of his face. "You weren't answering your phone." "I was in the library," Ellie said carefully, placing her bag down. "I told you I'd be home late." "No, you didn't," he said. "You said you'd be back after class." Her pulse quickened. "Silas, it was just. Were you with him?" Her stomach dropped. "Who?" "The guy from your econ class. The one you said was just nice." He said it like poison. "I wasn't with anyone," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was working." "Don't lie to me." He stood up. Too fast. His presence loomed suddenly larger than the room allowed. For a split second, Ellie didn't recognize him. The softness she had fallen in love with was gone. In its place was someone else. Someone watching her every move like it was a threat. He didn't touch her. Not that night. But she started locking the bathroom door after that. The next morning, Silas was back to making coffee. Back to soft smiles and soft apologies. "I was tired," he said. "You know how I get when I'm stressed. I just worry about you. I love you, Ellie. That's all it is." She nodded, but didn't speak. He kissed her forehead, told her to rest, said he'd clean the kitchen. Ellie stood in the shower for a long time that day. Let the water run too hot. Tried to scrub away the quiet fear rising under her skin. At school, she barely made it through her classes. Her grades slipped. She stopped going out. Stopped responding to messages. She didn't even open the one her mother sent that week. A photo of the mountains behind their house in Red Creek, with the caption, "The sky reminded me of you today." Silas started walking her to class, waiting outside buildings, asking questions that sounded like conversation, but felt like surveillance. He didn't say, "You belong to me." He didn't have to. Ellie still held the eagle keychain. Every few nights, when Silas fell asleep early, she'd sit by the window and run her fingers over the cool silver. Her mom had said it symbolized freedom, that no matter how far she flew, she'd always have a way home. But Ellie felt like her wings were pinned. And the most terrifying part? Somewhere deep inside, she had started to wonder if she deserved it. If maybe she had asked for too much. Winter fell hard over Chicago. The wind grew sharper, slicing between buildings and down alleyways like invisible blades. Snow gathered on window ledges and sidewalks, then melted into dirty slush, refrozen overnight. The cold seeped into everything: coats, bones, conversations. But inside the apartment, it was something else entirely. Still, heavy, muted. Silas spoke less and less. Or rather, he only spoke when he wanted something. Where once he filled the space with silly observations, late-night debates, and soft laughter, now there were only long stretches of silence interrupted by the scrape of a fork against a plate, the flick of a light switch, the clink of a coffee cup. It wasn't a house anymore. It was a cage wrapped in comfort. Ellie woke up each morning with a knot in her stomach, not knowing which version of Silas would be waiting. Sometimes he'd kiss her forehead and make breakfast. Other days, he'd barely acknowledge her. And when he did speak, it was with clipped phrases, subtle jabs disguised as concern. "You've been eating a lot of junk lately. Why'd you wear makeup today? Who are you trying to impress? Do you really think your parents still care what you're doing?" She stopped answering. What was the point? The calls from home kept coming at first, her mother's warm voice leaving voicemails that grew shorter with each day. "Just checking in, sweetheart. Call us when you can." Then, "I hope you're okay. We miss you." And later, "Ellie, please just send a text." But Ellie never responded. Not because she didn't want to, but because by the time she gathered the courage to write something, Silas would walk in, or stand too close, or glance at her phone, and suddenly the words disappeared. A few times, she managed to draft a message. "Hey Mom, I'm okay. Just been really busy. Miss you." But she never hit send. The drafts stayed buried in her phone, like little tombstones to the girl she used to be. At night, the silence pressed down hardest. There were no more evenings curled up on the couch. No more quiet jazz or late-night walks to the bodega. Silas worked more, or so he said. Sometimes he wouldn't come home until late. Sometimes he wouldn't come home at all. When he did, he was distant, distracted, smelled like cologne that wasn't his. And Ellie, exhausted and hollow, stopped asking questions. One night, she stood in the kitchen staring at the eagle keychain on the windowsill. It was still there, the last thing she unpacked when she moved in. Her mother had slipped it into her palm before she boarded the bus in Idaho, whispering, "So you always remember you can fly." Now, it felt like a relic from someone else's life. She picked it up, ran her thumb along the edge, closed her eyes. In her mind, she imagined what Red Creek looked like in winter. The snowbanks on the porch steps. The firewood stacked in the back. Her dad's heavy boots by the door. Her mom's voice calling her for supper. And in that moment, the ache was too much to contain. She sank to the floor and sobbed. Silently, violently. Her hands pressed to her mouth so he wouldn't hear. She cried for who she used to be, for who she was now, for the family she missed and the girl they thought was thriving. But most of all, she cried because she didn't know how to leave. Every time she imagined it, her chest tightened. What if Silas found out? What if he followed her? What if he told her she couldn't make it without him? And she believed him. The next day, she walked to campus for the first time in weeks without telling Silas. Her coat wasn't warm enough. Her shoes were soaked within minutes. But the air, bitter as it was, felt like something real, like something that didn't belong to him. On her way home, she stopped outside a payphone, one of the few still left standing. She stared at it for a long time, dug through her bag, found a crumpled bill, exchanged it for coins at the corner store. Her hands trembled as she dialed the number that was burned into her memory. It rang, and then her mother's voice. "Hello." Ellie couldn't speak. Her throat closed. "Hello?" Darlene asked again, a little louder now. "Is someone there?" Ellie opened her mouth. Nothing came out. I know this is you, baby," Darlene said, her voice cracking. "I can feel it. Please. Just say something. Just let us know you're okay." Tears rolled down Ellie's face. She pressed her forehead against the glass of the booth. "I love you," her mother whispered. "Wherever you are." Click. The dial tone returned. Ellie stood there long after the call ended. The cold numbed her fingers. Her heart throbbed with longing and shame and desperation. She had to do something, anything, because the silence wasn't just hurting her anymore. It was killing the people who loved her. If you're enjoying this story, leave your like, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications to stay updated with all our content. It was still dark when Everett Whitmore sat up in bed, pulled on his flannel shirt, and walked to the kitchen barefoot. The clock on the stove read 4:32 a.m. Darlene was already awake, though she hadn't left the bed. He could tell by the way she had stayed curled up on her side, unmoving, not quite sleeping. The silence between them had grown thick in recent weeks, not angry, but heavy, weighted with questions they didn't know how to ask out loud anymore. He poured himself a cup of the coffee she had set up the night before, lukewarm from the pot's heating plate. It tasted bitter. Everything did lately. A storm was rolling through Red Creek. The wind whipped outside, rattling the window panes. Snow tapped gently against the glass like fingers asking to be let in. Everett stared out into the dim, early light, his mind replaying the last real conversation they'd had with Ellie. It had been 3 months. 3. She had called them less and less, texted even less than that. And now, nothing. Not even a Merry Christmas or Happy New Year. Not even a lazy "Miss you too." Just a void. Darlene had grown thinner in the last few weeks. She hardly ate. Her sleep was shallow. Some mornings, Everett found her sitting on the edge of the bed with her phone in her lap, staring at the lock screen like she expected it to ring by sheer willpower. She was breaking, slowly but surely, and it terrified him. He thought maybe he had done the right thing by waiting, giving Ellie space, trusting she would come around. But something deep in his gut, something older than instinct, told him that waiting now wasn't patience. It was surrender. So he did the only thing he hadn't done yet. He packed a bag. Darlene came into the kitchen just as he zipped it up. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice raspy. Everett looked at her, at the sunken lines beneath her eyes, the way her hands trembled when she reached for the countertop. "I'm going to Chicago." Her breath caught. "Everett, I can't just sit here anymore, Dar," he said. "Not while you're wasting away with worry. Not while our girl's out there, God knows where, and we haven't heard her voice in months." Darlene's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. "Do you think something happened to her?" she whispered. He hesitated. "I think something's wrong," he replied. "I don't know what. But I'm not coming back without answers." She nodded, a tear trailing down her cheek. "Bring her home." "I will." He kissed her forehead and pulled on his coat. The bus ride to Chicago took nearly 2 days. He switched lines 3 times, slept sitting up, ate vending machine sandwiches and gas station coffee. But none of it mattered. He didn't even feel the miles passing beneath him, only the pounding of one thought in his chest: find Ellie. He arrived at Union Station on a Thursday afternoon. The sky was a flat, colorless gray, and everything about the city felt too loud, too fast, for a man who'd spent his whole life with mountain winds and quiet fields. He had only one address, the dorm she'd lived in her first semester. The man at the desk, a tired-looking security guard named Mr. Halford, remembered her. "She moved out a while back. Transferred off campus," he said. "Sorry, I don't have the new address. But she used to mention some guy. Silas, I think." Everett's stomach turned at the name. "Silas," he repeated. "You got a last name?" "Nope," the guard said. "But I know someone who might." It took 2 more hours and a stop at the university's housing office, but finally Everett found a student, a girl named Jamie from Ellie's economics class, who hesitated when he asked. "I haven't seen her in weeks," she said quietly, pulling her coat tighter. "I don't think she's okay." Everett's face hardened. "Where is she?" Jamie looked around like someone might be listening. "She was living with that guy, Silas something. He seemed nice at first, but lately, she looked different. Scared. Tired. He picked her up from class. Wouldn't let her hang out after. Last time I saw her, she had a bruise on her wrist. That was all Everett needed." It took him another 3 hours to track down the address in Logan Square, using only a name and a thread of conversation between students. When he finally stood in front of the brick building, the sky had already darkened. Apartment 3B. He climbed the stairs, his legs stiff from the bus, his heart beating so hard it echoed in his ears. He knocked once, then again, and again, louder this time. The door opened slowly, and Silas stood in the frame. Slim, clean-cut, too calm. "Can I help you?" he asked. "I'm looking for my daughter," Everett said. "Ellie." Silas didn't blink. "She's not here. I know she lives here." "She's not here," he repeated. "She went out. Won't be back for a while." Everett stared at him. There was no warmth, no apology, just cold indifference. "If she's not here," Everett said, forcing his voice to remain steady, "why haven't we heard from her in months?" "She's been busy. School, work, life. You know how it is." Everett stepped closer. "If you're lying to me, son." Silas didn't move. "She's an adult. She makes her own choices." Everett clenched his fists. He could hear something inside. Footsteps, maybe? A shift? Or maybe it was just his heartbeat pounding in his ears. "Tell her I came by," he said finally, and he turned around, but not to leave. Not really. He didn't go far. Just down the street to a diner. He waited until Silas left the apartment that night, watched him walk off in the opposite direction. Then Everett went back. He knocked on doors, spoke to neighbors. Most were indifferent, but one, an older woman in the next apartment, opened her door cautiously. "You Ellie's dad?" she asked, eyes wide. "Yes, ma'am. She hasn't been herself. We hear things. Crying. Sometimes shouting. That boy. I don't like him. I thought about calling someone. I should have." Everett's jaw clenched. He nodded, thanked her, then stepped into the hallway. For the first time since the journey began, a deeper fear gripped his chest. He had come to Chicago to find his daughter. Now he was afraid she might be just a floor away, and still lost. The sky over Chicago had turned a pale, washed-out blue. The kind of winter morning where the cold seeped beneath your clothes before you even stepped outside. Everett didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat on a bench across the street from the apartment, staring at the building like it was holding its breath. Like somewhere behind those bricks, behind those drawn curtains, his daughter was whispering, "Help me." He had seen enough. He had heard enough. And still, he didn't have her. By sunrise, Everett walked back up the cracked front steps of the building and pressed the buzzer for apartment 3B again. His hands were raw from the cold. This time, no one answered. He tried again. Nothing. So he waited in the stairwell, where the air was stale and smelled faintly of mildew and cigarette smoke. Around mid-morning, Silas came back. Everett stood up the moment he heard the door click open. Silas froze when he saw him. "I told you she's not here," he said, voice low, eyes hard. "I want to see her," Everett replied, calm but firm. "I said, if you don't let me see my daughter, I'm going to call the police and tell them everything. The silence, the missed classes, the bruises, the neighbors who've heard her crying. I'll tell them I think she's being held against her will, and you'll have to answer for that." Something shifted behind Silas's eyes. A flicker of panic. Then came the lie, clumsy and rushed. "She left a few days ago. Went to stay with a friend outside the city. She needed space, time to think." "What friend?" Everett snapped. "What city? Give me a name, a number, anything." Silas flinched. But before either of them could speak again, the door of apartment 3B creaked. Everett turned, and for a second he couldn't breathe. A silhouette stood at the end of the hall, thin, frail, hair tied in a messy knot, wrapped in a sweatshirt too big for her. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. But he'd know her anywhere. "Ellie," he whispered. She didn't move at first, just stared at him like she wasn't sure he was real, like she was afraid this was another cruel trick played by her exhausted mind. Then, slowly, she stepped forward. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Everett walked toward her, heart pounding, his eyes filling with tears. But he stopped when she gave the faintest shake of her head, a subtle, terrified gesture, and looked back toward the apartment door. She was afraid. Of him. Of Silas. Of what would happen if this moment wasn't handled carefully. "I'm here," Everett said, his voice cracking. "I'm not leaving without you." Silas stepped between them. "You need to go," he said to Ellie. "Inside. Now." But she didn't move. Everett watched the tension rise in her shoulders, the fear crawling up her spine like a weight she could no longer carry. Then, her hand slipped into her hoodie pocket. She pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. Without a word, She walked past both men, down the hall, and disappeared into the stairwell. Everett turned to follow, but by the time he reached the door, she was already gone. Back on the street, he looked everywhere, scanning the sidewalks, the bus stops, the people walking past. But Ellie had vanished like smoke in the wind. He returned to the building, pacing by the entrance, replaying her face in his mind, the way her lips trembled but never spoke. It wasn't until he turned to leave that the building's doorman, a quiet man named Leo who had been watching everything unfold, stepped outside. "Sir," he said, his voice gravelly, "are you Ellie's father?" Everett nodded, desperate. "Do you know where she went?" "I don't," Leo said carefully. "But she gave me this morning. Told me to give it to a man who matched your description." He handed over the folded paper. Everett opened it with trembling hands. The note was written in rushed, uneven handwriting. "Dad, I saw you yesterday. I wanted to run to you. I couldn't. He never lets me leave alone. I'm scared. I don't know how I let it get this far. But I need to get out. If I can sneak out tomorrow, meet me at Humboldt Park, near the big lion statue. 5 p.m. Please. Don't give up on me. It's now or never. Ellie." Everett read the words twice, and again, then folded the note, placed it in the inside pocket of his coat, and exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for weeks. She was alive. She wanted out. She was reaching for him, and he was going to be there, whatever it took. He didn't call the police. Not yet. He couldn't risk anything that would spook Silas or trap Ellie again in that suffocating place. He needed this escape to work. The rest of the day crawled. Everett walked the blocks around Humboldt Park. He studied every pathway, every street lamp, every line of sight around the lion statue she'd mentioned. He sat on a bench across from it as the sun dipped behind grey clouds, and he waited and waited until finally, footsteps, not fast, not running, just steady, determined. She appeared on the far end of the park, walking quickly, bundled in the same oversized hoodie. Her eyes scanned the benches. She saw him. "Dad," she said, the word bursting out in a breathless cry. Everett rose, and in that instant, all the distance, all the pain, all the silence broke. Ellie ran, tears already falling, and when she crashed into his arms, it was like the world exhaled. He held her tighter than he ever had before. "Let's go home, baby girl," he whispered. "Mom's waiting." And for the first time in a long, long time, Ellie believed she might finally be okay. The city was bathed in that strange, quiet light that only comes right before nightfall, not quite golden, not quite grey. Ellie could feel the cold air bite at her skin as she hurried through the side streets of Logan Square. Her breath formed small clouds, but she didn't slow down. Every step away from the apartment, away from Silas, felt like pushing through water. Her legs were weak. Her palms were sweating inside her sleeves. But she kept moving. She had lied to him. For the first time. She told Silas she needed to get cold medicine, that she was feeling dizzy and feverish. He didn't question her much. Maybe he was distracted. Maybe he thought she was too broken to run. Either way, she was out. For now. The streets blurred around her. She had no phone, no bag, just the crumpled $5 bill in her pocket and the note she'd written to her father, the one he'd received. She knew he had because yesterday, for a brief, blinding second, she saw him, standing on the corner, across the street from their apartment, looking up at the windows. She hadn't even realized she was crying until Silas called her from the kitchen, and the moment passed. But it had been real. Her father was here. He came for me. The thought alone was enough to keep her feet moving. When she reached the entrance to Humboldt Park, her chest was burning from the cold. Her ribs ached from the effort of holding back everything. The fear, the hope, the panic. She stopped for just a second, taking in the familiar paths she used to walk early in the semester, back when Chicago still felt like a city of dreams. Now, it looked like a place she might finally escape. The lion statue stood ahead, grand, stone, unmoving, guarding the park in silence. And then she saw him, Everett Whitmore, standing beside the statue with his back straight, scanning the walkways, his hands clenched inside his coat pockets. "Dad!" Ellie called out, the word splitting from her like it had been buried in her chest for too long. He turned. Their eyes locked. The seconds that passed felt like years as Ellie ran, her shoes scraping against the pavement, her breath catching on sobs. She crashed into him, arms wrapping around his body with a desperation that startled them both. He held her instantly, fiercely, like a man who'd been holding his own heart together with thread and had just gotten it back. "My baby," Everett whispered into her hair. "I've got you. You're safe now." Ellie broke down in his arms, shaking uncontrollably. It was like everything she had held inside, the silence, the pain, the loneliness, came pouring out. Her knees buckled, and Everett held her tighter, lowering them both gently to the bench behind them. For several minutes, neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. "I didn't know how to leave," she finally whispered, voice raw. "It didn't start out like that. He wasn't like that in the beginning." "You don't have to explain anything," Everett said, his voice cracking. I know, sweetheart. I was so scared. I thought if I told you, if I reached out, he'd take my phone, lock the doors." Sometimes he did. Everett swallowed hard, holding back his own tears. "But you found a way. You reached me. That's all that matters now." She pulled back just enough to look at him. Her face was thinner, paler than he remembered. There was a healing cut just above her eyebrow. Her eyes were hollow but alive. "Does Mom know?" she asked, terrified of the answer. "She knows I came looking," Everett replied. "She's been sick with worry. But she never gave up. We both knew something wasn't right." Ellie nodded, brushing at her face with her sleeve. "I don't have anything," she said quietly. "Not even a coat. Just this stupid hoodie." Everett took off his own jacket without hesitation and wrapped it around her shoulders. "You have everything you need. You have me. We're going home." But it wasn't quite that simple. Ellie's body stiffened. "Silas. He'll realize I'm gone soon. If he's not already looking." Everett's eyes darkened. "I already filed a missing person report. The police know your name. I've spoken to your university. There's a record of everything. If he shows up, he's done." Ellie's lips parted, surprised. You did all that?" "Of course I did." She didn't realize how much she had needed to hear that until now. For so long, she had been told by Silas that no one would come for her, that no one would believe her, that no one cared. But here her father was, with nothing but love in his hands and fire in his voice. She leaned into him again, her heart finally starting to slow. "Can we leave tonight?" she asked. "Soon as you're ready. Now." They took a cab back to Everett's motel on the edge of town. He paid in cash. Didn't speak much on the way, letting Ellie rest her head against the window. She dozed off for the first time in days, and Everett didn't wake her even after they'd stopped. He sat beside her, watching her sleep, keeping guard like a sentinel. When she stirred, he helped her upstairs, where he had already packed his own things, expecting this moment. She changed into a pair of sweatpants and a long-sleeved t-shirt he'd bought at the drugstore the day before. They didn't fit well, but she didn't care. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of the room she was in. That night, they slept in shifts. Every noise in the hallway made Everett sit up, but no one came. No knocks, no shouting, just silence. The good kind. The kind that meant peace. By morning, they boarded a Greyhound bus headed west. The same bus line Ellie had taken to leave Idaho. Now, it would bring her back. Ellie stared out the window as the skyline faded behind them, her hand tucked inside her father's. "Do you think I'll be okay?" she asked softly. Everett gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "I know you will." They didn't look back. The road back to Idaho stretched endlessly across the Midwest like a quiet ribbon of healing. Ellie sat near the window of the bus, forehead leaning against the cool glass as mile after mile of unfamiliar terrain passed her by. Barns, empty highways, rust-colored fields resting beneath an early spring sky. But she wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding. This time, she was going home. Everett sat beside her, his presence like a shield. Every now and then, he'd glance her way, not to check on her, but simply to remind himself she was real. Alive. Safe. Sitting right there, breathing the same air, after months of silence and uncertainty. Ellie still didn't speak much. Her voice was slow to return, buried under layers of emotional wreckage. But when she did speak, it was gentle, honest, as if every word now had weight. They arrived in Red Creek under a sky streaked with orange and pink, the sun casting long shadows over the mountains that framed the town. Everything looked smaller than Ellie remembered. The grocery store on the corner, the diner with the neon sign still flickering half-lit, the crooked fence by the Whitmore house that Everett always swore he'd fix but never did. But nothing hit harder than the porch light. It was on. It had never been off. Darlene sat in the wooden rocking chair on the front porch, wrapped in a shawl despite the mild evening. Her face was pale and thinner than Ellie remembered, but the moment she saw the bus slow near the corner, something shifted in her eyes. She rose, hands trembling. When Ellie stepped off the last step of the bus and onto the dusty road, Darlene crossed the porch without thinking, bare feet, tears already falling. Ellie dropped her bag. They met halfway across the yard, arms wrapping around each other like rope holding a sinking ship together. "You came back," Darlene whispered against her daughter's hair, her voice breaking. "I knew you would. I prayed every night." Ellie nodded into her mother's shoulder, letting the sobs rise without shame. "I'm sorry, Mama. I wanted to call. I wanted to come home." "You are home now," Darlene said, her voice full of strength despite the tears. "That's all that matters." They stayed there a long time, clinging to each other, as Everett stood a few steps behind, wiping his face with the sleeve of his jacket, trying and failing to hide his own emotions. That night, the house smelled of old memories, the faint scent of lavender, the wood stove, the old cedar floors. Everett made grilled cheese sandwiches, the only thing he said he could cook without screwing up. Ellie didn't eat much, but the comfort of the kitchen, the way her father hummed while he cooked, and the way her mother held her hand across the table, it all stitched something back together inside her. The next few weeks moved slowly. There were doctor visits, for Darlene, who had been weakened by the stress of the past months. For Ellie, who had stopped sleeping through the night, haunted by dreams that made her wake in a cold sweat. But progress came, inch by inch. On the porch in the mornings, Darlene and Ellie sat wrapped in blankets, sipping weak tea. They talked about everything and nothing. Some days, They just sat in silence. On better days, Ellie even laughed. She never talked much about Silas. But when the time came, she gave a statement to the authorities. Quietly, firmly. A woman from a local advocacy group helped her through the process. Silas had vanished after she left, disconnected his phone, cleared out of the apartment. But with the report from Everett and the evidence collected from the university and neighbors, the police had enough to open an investigation. But Ellie didn't wait for justice. She focused on healing. Her return to college wasn't immediate. At first, she couldn't even hear the word Chicago without flinching. But over time, with her mother's strength and her father's patience, she started to find herself again. Not the girl she was before, but someone new. Someone who had been through fire and came out breathing. When Darlene passed away peacefully 6 months later, Ellie was holding her hand. They had talked about everything by then. There were no unspoken words, no unanswered questions. Darlene passed with a smile, whispering her daughter's name, and Ellie promised to carry that love with her forever. The grief was heavy, but it didn't break her. After the funeral, Ellie and Everett sat on the back porch, overlooking the wild fields and distant ridges. "I've been thinking," Ellie said, breaking the quiet. "I want to go back. To Chicago. To finish school." Everett didn't say anything right away. He stared out at the horizon, nodding slowly. "You sure?" "No," Ellie said honestly. "But I need to finish what I started. I want to do something with what I've lived through. I want to help other girls like me." Everett turned to her. "Then we'll go." Ellie smiled. "We?" He shrugged. "What, you think I'm letting you move back there alone? I'll find something to do. Fixing fences. Teaching these city kids how to change a tire. I'll keep busy." Ellie laughed, the sound light and true. "Deal." So they went back. Not to the same apartment. Not to the same life. This time, they found a small walk-up in a quiet neighborhood. Ellie returned to her studies, now majoring in social work. Everett got involved in a local community center, helping kids from rough neighborhoods find direction, sometimes just by listening. Every morning, Ellie passed the tiny wooden eagle her mother had given her, now perched by the window, its wings spread wide, always watching. It reminded her of who she was, where she came from, and the family that had never stopped waiting for her. One spring afternoon, as she walked across the university courtyard in her cap and gown, she spotted Everett standing in the crowd, clapping, his eyes wet with tears. She had made it. Not despite everything, but because of it. Love had carried her, pain had shaped her, and strength had brought her home. And if you like this story, you'll surely love the next one appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like, and turn on notifications. See you next time.